Hi, and welcome to lecture number 43. Today we're talking about topic 5.9, government policies during the Civil War. And the theme we're looking at is American and national identity. The learning objective for today is explain how Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War impacted American ideals over the course of the war. And to begin, we're going to talk about Lincoln and most Union supporters began the Civil War to preserve the Union, but Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation reframed the purpose of the war. So Lincoln has an evolution and a change of heart in regards to slavery from the beginning and over the course of the Civil War. This is clearly seen in a letter that he writes to the New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley, who had been an abolitionist and had written to Lincoln asking him to take this as an opportunity to abolish slavery. And he writes back saying that his paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. A lot of his hesitation that he had early on in the war is in keeping the border states as part of the Union. If he were to abolish slavery, those border states that still practiced slavery would have surely joined the Confederacy, and it would have made fighting the war much harder. But as the war goes on, Lincoln sees that it is a necessity, both morally and militarily, to abolish slavery. So he issues out the Emancipation Proclamation, and he wants to wait until a military victory happens for the Union Army, and the closest that he got to a military victory was the Battle of Antietam. The wording from the Emancipation Proclamation says, "And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God." So here he's telling us that it is a moral necessity, saying that it's an act of justice, but he's also bringing up the military necessity because the Emancipation Proclamation is going to hurt the Confederacy as enslaved people who are being freed from enslavement in Confederate territory are no longer going to be working on the fields or producing materials that are going to aid the Confederate Army. The 13th Amendment is going to eventually abolish slavery everywhere in the United States. The proclamation only did so in territory that was held by the Confederacy. That means that in the border states or the areas and territories that had already come under Union control, slavery was allowed to continue. But the 13th Amendment was going to abolish slavery everywhere in the United States. It passes Congress in January of 1865, and it won't be ratified until the end of the year in 1865, so Lincoln is going to die before ratification. He's assassinated in April of 1865. Lastly, the second inaugural address of Lincoln is where we see again that Lincoln is framing slavery as the cause for the Civil War, and so therefore it is the reason why the Union continues to fight. And very shortly after his inaugural address, just a couple weeks, he will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. All right, so Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation reframed the purpose of the war and helped prevent the Confederacy from gaining full diplomatic support from European powers. The main European power that we're concerned with is Great Britain because they were a strong trading partner with the southern states for their cotton. And Great Britain's growing labor class had always disliked slavery because enslaved labor directly competes against free labor and it diminishes the wages of those people who are working for a wage. Britain had first flirted with the idea of giving recognition to the Confederate States of America. There was an incident in which two Confederate diplomats are taken off of a British boat called the Trent by the Union Navy, and Great Britain gets really angry with the United States for abducting these two diplomats on a British vessel, so the United States has to return the diplomats back to the Confederacy. Additionally, there was a contract to sell these ironclad rams to the Confederacy by a firm that was owned by the Laird family in England. And as you can see on the bottom and then the top right, these ships are heavily fortified on the sides. That's metal that you see there, and they are steam powered. And if these two ships would have been delivered to the Confederacy, they could have very much hurt the blockade that the Union was trying to implement around the southern ports. And if the blockade didn't work, then the Confederacy would be able to export its cotton once again and exchange that for cash or for weapons from other trading partners. So it was critical that these Laird rams were not delivered to the Confederacy. That's why the United States stepped in and forced the British government to confiscate them from the private firm, and then they ended up becoming part of the British Royal Navy. Britain will eventually find cotton suppliers in Egypt and India, and so therefore it won't have as much of an incentive to recognize the Confederacy or get itself involved in this American war. So many African Americans fled southern plantations and enlisted in the Union Army, helping to undermine the Confederacy. So these were people who freed themselves after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. When they heard that this had been issued, they walked off their plantations into Union lines. There were also free African Americans in the North who took the Emancipation Proclamation as a sign of greater things to come for equality and freedom for all people, regardless of whether they live in rebel territory or Union territory. There were segregated army units in which African Americans fought. Almost 200,000 served in the Union Army and Navy, though these units were segregated, they had lower pay, and despite all of that, they actually had better veteran leadership compared to the state volunteer regiments, because these were federal regiments. People like Frederick Douglass were in charge of recruiting black soldiers to join these regiments, the most famous of which is the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, after their assault on Fort Wagner. From their assault on Fort Wagner, there is a Medal of Honor recipient, Sergeant Kearney, seen on the bottom left. He is awarded the Medal of Honor for saving his regiment's colors, that's the flag, in the midst of the attack. Initially, the Confederacy, whenever they took prisoners that were of black soldiers, they were punished or killed. The Confederate Congress had passed legislation for the punishment and killing of these POWs, but when Abraham Lincoln insisted on the equal treatment for exchange purposes, the Confederacy changed their tone, because if the Confederacy started to kill American prisoners of war, then Lincoln said that the United States would do the same. And then on the bottom right, you see the largest Confederate prison of war, which is called Andersonville Prison in Georgia. And there were really bad conditions. So despite them receiving equal treatment in the end with white POWs, they all experienced hardship and short of supplies and food. So Lincoln sought to reunify the country and used speeches such as the Gettysburg Address to portray the struggle against slavery as the fulfillment of America's founding democratic ideals. So the first attempt at unification was in the 1864 election. The Republican Party changes its name temporarily to the Unionist Party or the National Union Party. He changes his vice president and takes on Andrew Johnson on the ticket. Andrew Johnson was a loyal Democrat, or he was loyal to the Union, and he was from Tennessee. And so this union is created in order to garner more support, since Abraham Lincoln was being challenged for the presidency by General George McClellan. He had not been happy that he'd been fired from the position of general of the Army of the Potomac twice, so he decided to go after Lincoln's job because he thought that he could do a better job of handling the war. And in 1864, Lincoln wins the election, partly due to the victories that happened in early 1864 for the Union Army, and also the support that he had from the Union soldiers who were able to vote through absentee ballots for the very first time. At the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln visits the battlefield that had just finished the fighting 3 months earlier, and they are dedicating a part of the battlefield to become a cemetery. And he notes the soldiers' sacrifice for a new birth of freedom. So this wording is really important because it's signifying that there is a new chapter that is being created in the country, and this is what the College Board's key concept outline refers to as the fulfillment of America's founding democratic ideas, that now we are getting closer to the original promises of the founding documents of the Declaration of Independence. There's a challenge to keep the government of, by, and for the people from perishing from the earth. So that's Lincoln's wording there, that's what the war is posing to the country at the moment. And so it's an existential battle to fulfill these promises that were made so long ago. All right. So we're going to finish up here with a couple more government policies from the Civil War. These aren't mentioned really in the key concept outline, but they are still really important because all of them are part of a larger pattern that is expanding the size of the federal government during the Civil War. So the first one is the 1863 Conscription Act. We've talked about this in the previous lecture. Men ages of 20 to 45 are now open to the draft. It was really unpopular in the North or the Northeast. In New York City, there were draft riots and violence directed against African Americans. The National Bank Act of 1863 was passed to finance the war, to create a national currency and address the inflation that was happening through the printing of greenbacks. So an example of those greenbacks is there on the right side. You see what an original $10 bill looked like. And Lincoln, when he came into office, we've talked about how he suspended habeas corpus, especially in Maryland, where there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers. And according to the Constitution, the only branch of government that is able to suspend habeas corpus is Congress. And so because Lincoln did so as president, there was a legal challenge against it. So Ex parte Merryman was a decision written by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, trying to get Abraham Lincoln to stop suspending habeas corpus and allow those Confederate sympathizers to continue to sabotage the efforts of the Union. And then Ex parte Milligan refers to the pattern of the Union Army trying Confederate sympathizers who are civilians and are trying to sabotage the Union efforts in the war in military tribunals. So Ex parte Milligan says that U.S. citizens cannot be tried by military tribunals when there are civil courts available. So these are both civil liberties decisions, which are important, but here Abraham Lincoln had a very difficult moral dilemma. Does he follow the words of the Constitution, or does he allow the Confederate sympathizers to continue to sabotage the Union forces? So these peace Democrats or Copperheads, they were often sympathizing with the Confederacy, and they just marginally supported the Union over the Confederacy. But they definitely disliked the war, and they definitely disliked Lincoln, as is seen here on the bottom right. It was a pamphlet that is racializing Abraham Lincoln as someone who supports Black Americans, calling him Abraham Africanus the First, so posing him as if he is a king. All right, and then the last group here of government policies are the Morrill Tariff Act. This was passed in order to raise revenue, to protect domestic industries. You see in the chart down below, right where it says 1860, you see a huge spike in the tariff rates. The Pacific Railway Act approves the transcontinental railroad route that will go from western United States to California, and because it's passed in the midst of the Civil War, it's going to be a northern route. A southern route will come later on once the Reconstruction happens. The Homestead Act of 1862 gives 160 acres to people who are moving west and are willing to settle on the land, improve it, and stay there for 5 years. After the 5 years, that land is theirs to keep. And then finally, the Morrill Land Grant Act. These are encouraging states to put forth the profits from land sales into states to in states to fund colleges that are going to specialize in agriculture and engineering. So Abraham Lincoln had a jam-packed term as president. So even if he had not had to fight the Civil War and win the Civil War and maintain the Union, he still would have had a pretty jam-packed presidency in which he covered a lot and expanded the size of the federal government. And all of these things that he passed here are going to affect the country for decades to come, as we'll see. All right, so let's talk about the recap. The Emancipation Proclamation reframed the purpose of the war. The Confederacy failed to gain international support or recognition from Great Britain. African Americans joined in the war effort by fighting in military and Navy units. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address has equal importance as other foundational documents. And finally, the Civil War expanded the size and the role of the federal government. All right, well, that is it for today. Thank you for watching. In our next 2 lectures, we're going to talk about Reconstruction, so I'll see you then.